Few groups of flowering plants have such a long season as clematis. Here on the west-facing wall of Brook Cottage, Pelle d'Azur is at its peak. And as you can see, there's nothing quite like these large flowered forms for giving the garden a bit of oomph. They come in a range of colours and between them can provide a spectacle from May until the autumn. Joining them are a host of smaller flowered varieties. Individually the blooms may not be as dramatic, but they're full of personality. This is Minuet with a white stripe through the magenta. And like most of them, it appears in a great cloudburst. Alba luxurians looks as if it's been dipped in green ink. And this is one of my favourites, a climber with one of the longest names of any garden plant, Clematis Viticella purpurea plana elegans, with double rosettes the colour of faded velvet curtains. The obvious place to put clematis is up walls, and here they're grown both in sun and shade. There are other ways of growing them. They're effective out in the open border, grown up wire-covered posts and frames to provide a vertical accent or a plume of late colour. This is Victoria in partnership with the smaller flowered Étoile Violette. And here they're actually also serving a double purpose, blotting out a manhole cover. Of course, clematis are most at home growing into a living support. Here, Madame Julia Correvon is scrambling into an upright cherry, having been planted a few feet away. But often it's neater and easier to plant the clematis up against a wall or fence and simply train its flowering stems into the host shrub or tree. Clematis Viticella is giving a second flowering season to the Moroccan broom. And Buddleia Nanho Blue is partnered by the mauve Margaret Hunt. All clematis want a good support system to twine through, and against a wall, one of the best methods is a widely spaced mesh with vertical as well as horizontal wires. The stems can then be trained out into a fan shape. There's a lot of confusion over the pruning of clematis, but all these late-blooming, large and small-flowered varieties of Brook Cottage are treated in the same way, cut back to a low framework of stems in late February or March. This keeps the plants fairly well clothed, almost to the ground, and the flower power is boosted by a good dollop of manure in spring, and occasionally a high potash feed a little later. A cool, moist root run is the other key to success. If there isn't natural shade, a piece of broken pot or pipe around the roots will help to create it. Afterwards, it's a matter of watering frequently during dry spells. Here it's done once a week. Really, it's very hard to think of another group of plants that can rival clematis for sheer flower impact so late in the year. And here in August, there are varieties like Étoile Rose still only poised to launch themselves over the border.
This ivy has been at Barnsdale longer than I have. And it wasn't until I pulled some of it off that I realised that it was hiding some very attractive stone and brickwork. So now I want to pull all of it off and replace it with something a little more attractive. In all the years that it's been here, this ivy hasn't really done any damage to the wall at all. It's when you start pulling it off that it can damage old mortar, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to do a little bit of repointing here. A better bet is to get right down at the bottom and cut it off and then dig out to the roots, and instead of pulling this off, just allow it to die and then it'll pull off quite easily. Or alternatively, you can even let it fall off of its own accord, though of course that takes some time. But on modern walls with modern mortar, you really shouldn't have any problems at all. If you want to plant a new ivy, or any self-clinging climber comes to that, like Virginia creeper or climbing hydrangea, there's one important point to remember, and that is that it's only the new growth that will stick to the wall. So when you go down to the garden centre and you're tempted to buy a plant like this, remember that none of this old growth will actually stick to the wall, and there's not a lot of point in fixing it to the wall either, because the top of it will then wave around and the new growth will have great difficulty sticking to the wall. You're much better off to buy a smaller, cheaper plant like this. Make the hole a good foot or two from the wall, where it'll get a bit of moisture, and prepare the soil really well with lots of organic matter, and then it can be planted in just the normal way. And then what you do is you simply point the shoots in the direction of the wall, and you can hold them down there with a couple of these little wire staples, and then very soon that'll hit the wall, and as soon as it does, the new growth will fix to the wall and away it'll go. The AgriFrames garden is the first one to be built outside at the show, and it won a gold medal, so I'm quite sure we can look forward to lots more in the future. And this is a perfect example of how to grow climbers, and particularly what to grow. Now, if you have a south-facing wall, for example, how about something like the potato vine Solanum jasminoides album? I can just get away with this at Barnstable, but it is on the borderline of hardiness. So if you live in a colder area, you'd be better off with the purple-flowered Solanum crispum. There are, of course, lots of clematis for south-facing walls in all sorts of colours. Or how about the lovely Actinidia colomicta with its superb coloured foliage right the way through the season? Now, if your wall faces north, there are several honeysuckles that will do well there. Or there's variegated ivy, and of course, lots of roses. From the time that you first plant Wisteria to the time it flowers can take many years. And even then, a continuing abundance of blooms depends on judicious pruning. Channel 4 newsreader Caroline Wrighton and her husband Mark, who run the Crown pub at Burnham Beeches near Slough, have an even greater problem than most, as their wisteria is one of the largest and oldest in the country, and about to get out of hand. We visited them on the day its half-yearly pruning takes place, and invited Tony Kirkham, a tree specialist from Kew, to explain to Caroline the best way to deal with this beautiful shrub.
This is Wisteria sinensis from China, and it was introduced in 1816, the original plant, but it wasn't readily available until about 1830 from the nurseries. So I would say this is one of the early plantings, which makes it about 160 years old, which is a good age for a plant like this.
Well, it's thriving here. I mean, it just wants to go rampant over the roof, which is why we have to have it pruned.
Yes, well, in the wild, it can reach anything up to 90 feet.
Can it do damage?
It's moved roofing tiles and it has done some structural damage. So you've got a major problem here, and you have to control it first and bring it back down to the gutter.
Right, now we're pruning it now, but it actually had a second flush of flowers. Should you do it again after the main flowering in the spring?
This plant flowers in May, usually, but generally speaking, it has a second flush of flowers around August, so it's not uncommon. And depending on the summer, on the climate, then you will get this second flush of flowers. But the main pruning should be done in August, the first pruning, and then you have a second pruning exercise in February, in the winter, which will then encourage more flower.
And presumably you prune it back more then, would you, after that main flower?
You prune harder in February.
If one was buying a new wisteria, what should you look out for?
Well, first of all, buy it from a reputable dealer, from a reputable nurseryman, and buy a vegetatively propagated material. And usually this material is grafted, and you will get flowers early.
Can you show me exactly whereabouts we're pruning it on these long taily bits that are coming down?
Yes, it's probably easier if I show you from a piece of material here. What the plant does is produce this long fleshy growth. Here's a good example, and the idea is to prune them back to about 6 inches. By doing this, we will encourage these buds to produce flower buds rather than vegetative material, which would then produce leaf. Then in February we will be left with this 6-inch shoot with about 5 buds on. It would also look something similar to this because it would have hardened off. And we will prune that back to 3 buds, 1, 2, 3, to leave a spur, which will then produce a good show in May.
Well, I know it's a spectacular, and I mean, it's such an integral part of the bud, quite honestly, that we've always said if anything happened to it, then we'd leave too.
Perfume in my arbour comes from roses, but one of the plants they would have used in the old gardens quite widely would have been the native honeysuckle, or what they called woodbine. Of course, that's been superseded these days by many other varieties, but I still think that the old woodbine has the very best fragrance of all. So I wanted to grow it in my own garden. Well, there are nurseries who stock it, but I searched around and couldn't find it at all. And then one day, no doubt because of the horseshoe nailed to my arbour, I had an amazing piece of luck. I was standing at the garden gate and looking out at the hedgerow nearby, when suddenly I saw, growing over an old wire fence, the native woodbine. I don't know how it got there, perhaps a seed was dropped by a bird, but that now enabled me to do exactly what the old cottagers would have done to bring it into my own garden. Now, of course, these days you can't dig up wild plants, that's against the law. But what you can do is, in June or July, to take leaf bud cuttings, and they're a lot easier than they sound. The first thing to do is to take off a stem, and you get several cuttings from one stem, put it into a polythene bag, keep it in the shade and get home as fast as you can. And then you cut the stem up, cutting either side of a leaf to leave pieces of stem, I suppose something like 1 inch long. Now, don't put hormone rooting powder on them because that could stop them growing out. Just as they are, put them into a pot of coir compost so that the top of the bud is just above compost level. Cover them up with a polythene bag, put an elastic band around it and put them in the cold frame. They should root in about 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, if you want one plant, take 10 cuttings. Yes, we all do have our gardening passions, don't we? And one of mine is sweet peas. So here in my parterre garden, I'm going to use them to solve a particular problem. But first of all, I think you'll be interested in the results of a little trial here. Now, these sweet peas were sown in a cold frame in September. These were sown also in a cold frame in November, and these were sown in February. And I think it's pretty obvious that if you want really first-rate plants, then the September sowing is the one to go for. Now, if you're growing your sweet peas scrambling up a support, then you want as many side shoots as you can get. So if they haven't already started making them, now's the time just to pinch out the top with your thumb and forefinger, and they'll soon start growing out. This one was done a couple of weeks ago, and you can see that already the side shoots are beginning to come. Now I'm going to use these to solve this problem of mine. These angle iron posts support my fan-trained fruit trees, and angle iron at the best of times is not a very pretty material. So what I've done is to surround them with this cylinder of wire netting, which I've sprayed blue, and now I'm going to plant my sweet peas at the base here, and that should grow away pretty fast, scramble up the thing and look really beautiful. But if you want real exhibition sweet peas, there's a better way to do it. Every year on my allotment I grow miles too many runner beans, with the result that many of them simply don't get picked. So this year I'm going to cut down on the beans and use the canes to grow some exhibition sweet peas. Now the canes are set a foot apart for beans, but for sweet peas you could go quite a bit closer at 8 or 9 inches. And notice too that I've put down some black polythene in between the two rows, because there's nothing worse than trying to weed in between the rows of beans or sweet peas. Now the sweet peas are planted up against the cane in the normal way. And just look at that root system, that's really nice, isn't it? And they just go in there like that. But now, instead of growing several side shoots up, you only use one shoot like that. So you cut out the side shoots. Bear in mind it is a side shoot and not the main stem, because that's likely to go blind early on in the season. Now later in the season you're going to have to take out all the side shoots and all the tendrils from this stem too. So quite obviously it's not going to be able to support itself. So you've got to help it, and I use these little sweet pea rings and just put it up against the plant like that, round the cane. Perfect. Now this variety is so new that I'm not actually allowed to tell you what it is just yet, but hopefully all will be revealed at the Chelsea Flower Show in the middle of May. Well, Diane Sewell, another wonderful display of sweet peas, and I know you've got a new variety this year. Tell us about it.
Well, it's a bright mauve one, very sweetly scented, and it's taken about 7 years to breed, and we hope it's going to be a winner. It's very striking, and hopefully it will sell well.
Well, Diane, I know what it's called, but you tell them, will you?
Jeff Hamilton, after you.
For those plants that like to keep their roots cool, like bougainvilleas, the ideal thing is to have a bed in the floor. Now, I appreciate that most conservatories can't do that, but it's perfectly okay to grow in stone or terracotta pots. Now, they'll need feeding at every watering, and it's best if you can keep them a little bit pot-bound, because that will increase the flowering. But of course they will need repotting from time to time, and that could be quite a problem for an established climber like this Pandaria. But it's not impossible. Now, always pot into the next size pot up, and then the difficult bit is taking the plant out of the pot. Oh, that's not too bad at all. I gave this a good watering before I did this job. Stand that down there carefully. Now, a little bit of compost in the bottom of the pot, and I'm using here a coir bark mix with some fertiliser in it. It works very well indeed. Put the other pot inside and then just work some compost down the edges of the pot like this. And when you're sure you've filled it all up, a good tap down. I'll fill it all up again because it's going to sink down quite a bit. Another tap down, and now keep your fingers crossed. Hopefully that should come out, leaving a nice wall of compost all the way around. And now we can carefully bring it in here. Lift up the plant. Put it straight back in like that. A little bit more around the top. And then give it a really good watering And the plant should grow away well and should flower for months, helping to make my own little bit of the Mediterranean. Since the Clean Air Act in the 1950s cut the sulphur in the air, black spot has been the scourge of roses, and this variety gets it particularly badly. This is Paul Scarlet, and it is prone to black spots, and quite honestly I don't think it's a very good variety anyway, so my answer is going to be to pull it out and replace it with a variety that is disease resistant. Now of course I'm not suggesting that you should pull out all your roses, but what I do suggest is that before you buy new ones you should check very carefully to make sure that they're disease resistant, because quite a few of them now are. But replacing roses is not that straightforward, because if you put new roses where old ones have been, they're quite likely to suffer from a disease called replant disease, and that can kill them. Now, there's not a lot known about this disease at the moment. Some people think that it's due to eelworm and others to poisons from the roots of the old roses. Now you can actually sterilise the soil with chemicals, but it's a bit complicated and not that effective. But one very effective way is to replace the soil. I'm replacing another disastrous rose down here, and I've already dug the hole, which should be 2 foot square by at least 1 foot deep. I put a bit of compost or manure in the bottom and then refill with soil. A little bit more muck on the top, and you're ready for planting. I'm going to replace this one with a variety called Dublin Bay, which is a lovely deep red, slightly scented, and this one is more resistant to black spot. So that one should do quite well. Now you'll have noticed on the Paul Scarlet that all the blooms were up at the top. And that is down to the pruning. And quite honestly, that isn't the best way to do it. This is the way you should really train them. These have been tied very closely around the posts, and you can see that they've been pulled down quite a bit too. That restricts the sap and encourages blooms right the way from the bottom of the plant up to the top again. And this is an old variety called Alberic barbier, and it's got these lovely, slightly scented, creamy yellow blooms. But it won't go on flowering right the way through the season. So what I've done here is to grow through it a clematis called Wisteria étoile violette, and that will give me nice, deep purple blooms in the autumn when the rose has finished flowering. And then when the clematis is finished, you can cut it right down at the bottom, pull out all the old rubbish, and the following year it'll do the same thing again for you. Now this one is particularly good as a rose for a post like this, but it's also good on a north-facing situation too. Clematis are without doubt our most popular flowering climber, and it's not difficult to see why. This one is particularly interesting because this was the very first cross that is still surviving. It's called Clematis Eriostemon hendersonii, and it was first produced in 1820. But it came from 2 parents that came to this country in the 16th century. So we've been going clematis here for quite some time. This is a straight species rather than a hybrid. It's Clematis tangutica, and I love it for these nodding yellow flowers which appear together with the fluffy white seed heads. Now this is scrambling up the wall, which is the conventional way that most of us grow it. But one of the great advantages with going to a garden which is open to the public is that you can see all sorts of other ideas that you can take away and use in your own garden. Here at Burford House in Shropshire, there are all sorts of imaginative ways for using clematis. But this garden was created by John Treasure, and nobody knows more about using clematis than he does.
I rather like growing clematis through trees, especially trees that don't flower. for example, this conifer. Here we have a Montana variety, and it's a vigorous plant.
Not many of us have room for a tree this big.
No, there are a lot of other trees that can be used, and there are a lot of other species that can be used. Smaller trees, and not so vigorous species.
It's just a case of choosing the right variety.
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Clematis texensis, for example, is a native of Texas, and it's the only scarlet clematis in existence. This one is a hybrid of that called Sir Trevor Lawrence, and doesn't it look good growing through this cotoneaster? Clematis viticella is another good variety like that, and this one is growing through a Philadelphus. Now, what you can do with both of these is to cut them hard back in November. You can pull all the rubbish out then so that it looks nice and neat, and it'll give the host plants a chance to thrive. But of course, as well as using them to add flowers to plants that aren't in flower, you can also plant a variety that flowers at the same time as the host plant so that the flowers complement each other. I think this Florida alba growing through the ceanothus looks perfect. The uses of clematis really are endless. Here's an ugly old stump, too big to dig out of the border. So instead it's been covered with wire netting, and you can see that this little clematis has already made a start on turning it into what will one day be a flowery feature. And how's this for another brilliant idea? Down this end, a standard bedding scheme using fuchsias. But up this end, clematis running along the ground in between the fuchsias to enhance the scheme. Now, of course, if you're going to do this, you've got to make sure that the clematis grow in the right place. So you do that with a series of wire pegs to just hold it in place, and then they'll grow exactly where you want them to. You can use much the same idea to grow clematis over low-growing evergreens. But of course, if the two plants are in flower together, once again, you've got to make sure that the colours blend. This Rouge Cardinal clematis and the pink flowering heather are just another example of the John Treasure magic touch. But of course, when heathers go out of flower, they can look a bit drab. So who will believe that this is a heather bed? It looks marvellous, doesn't it? Because it's been brightened up for the late summer with clematis. This one is Étoile Violette, and this is the aptly named Abundance. Now, both these are Viticella varieties, so both will be pruned down hard in November. All this top growth will be taken away, and from then on, the heathers will take over, and they'll flower their hearts out. It's a perfect combination, and it certainly makes me see clematis in an entirely different light.